Hi, everyone. My name is Jerry Timbrook from RTI International, and I am recording this interview today from Lincoln, Nebraska. So, this talk is a part of an AAPOR series on pioneers of survey research. Today, I'll be talking with Stuart Michaels as a part of this Pioneers in Survey Research interview series. Stuart has over 40 years of experience in surveys and qualitative interviews and is currently a senior research scientist at NORC at the University of Chicago. Stuart's primary substantive focus is on sexuality and health outcomes across the life course. He's a foundational contributor to the study of sex and health, particularly sexual minorities. So it's great timing that we're recording this at the beginning of Pride Month. As project director of the 1992 National Health and Social Life Survey, Stuart helped design and oversee all aspects of this first national, representative, population-based survey devoted primarily to sexual behavior of U.S. adults. He also worked on the follow-up Chicago Health and Social Life Survey and co-authored The Social Organization of Sexuality: Sexual Practices in the U.S. So, Stuart, with all that said, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. So, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jerry. I feel very honored to be asked to, especially with a grandiose title, pioneer. But in many ways, I think I've thought about that myself, that we were doing something and I got a chance to participate in what was a really pioneering project. And then I think that's, I'm also, we're obviously doing this in part because there's an interest in the fact that I was an openly gay man and a senior member of that project. And that was a very unusual thing in that time. So I think that, and it's Pride Month, and AAPOR and other organizations are recognize this. This is now part of our popular culture. One of the things that's kind of interesting that as I was reflecting about this and where I come from and how I got started, um, it strikes me, I was born in the early 50s. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. And I graduated from high school in 1969, which is the year of Stonewall. Of course,
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about Stonewall.
Huh.
I knew about Woodstock, but so, back in those days, being somebody beginning their sexual mature life and figuring it out, it was a very, very different world. Um, and so that's part of the interest, I think, about talking about this and the study of sex, because in sexuality and surveys, because that's part of the story. It's a product of that evolution. And was sort of one thing I realized is I was kind of the right person, maybe, but certainly lucky I was in the right place at the right time, as it turns out, because it took me quite a long time to get to the beginning of this project, which for me began in 1988. I like to call this project, the National Health and Social Life Survey, the Kinsey Study for the Age of AIDS. And one of the reasons is to pay homage to Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues, who in the 30s and 40s were actually the first people to try to do what basically we tried to do again much later, which was to interview a representative sample of the population about things that nobody talked about or that are hard to ask people about, in particular, their sexual behavior. Of course, and I don't, we and many people have criticized Kinsey for not using modern probability sampling methods. And that was a huge limitation to those incredibly important works. There were two books. There was a book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, in 1948 and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. But on the other hand, I also recognize that Kinsey actually reached out to people in survey research. He was following in a
Oh,
tradition that was just beginning of modern survey research, but probability sampling, he didn't figure out probability sampling. And that was a big criticism of our colleagues at the end of his study. But there was big, I'm getting off on this background history for two reasons. One is it's interesting to me and important, and it was a precursor. Second of all, I think we've lost, first, and Kinsey also had, and that work had tremendous cultural impact. It was the big news for years, and it had a huge impact on the evolution of modern gay life because there was information for the first time about sexual behavior, including homosexual behavior, both for men and for women. And when people saw that in the 40s, it was incredibly, I mean, you read this in many, many biographies, especially of gay men, writers, and intellectuals of that period, that this was incredible sort of revelation and relief. The other thing that I think it's important to point out is that that study was, this is the McCarthy period when the
mm,
volume on females, the second volume, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. By the way, Kinsey was a biologist who studied insects. So for him, these were males and females, and he was applying methods that you would use in field research on insects. So he could be quite objective in many, many ways, although obviously he was also on a crusade to find out about things that people didn't know about and weren't talking about. Um, the other thing is, especially when the volume on females came out, there was a huge backlash. And this was the McCarthy period. And so the funding, which had come from the Rockefeller Foundation, I believe, was pulled. The University of Indiana kind of freaked out because he was a professor there and the institute was part of the university, but he was also protected by the leaders of the university. And the institute exists today, as far as I know. I've been there, but it's independent, and it was made independent at that time to preserve the possibility.
yeah.
On the other hand, what's really important for our research is that nobody goes back to try to redo and improve, even though they had tremendous respect for the research. It's too scary. There's too much political, cultural and political stigma attached to these issues. So in effect, there's really no really comparable research from that period till the late 80s. There are minor attempts. There was actually, the Kinsey Institute itself tried to do a real survey using NORC at the University of Chicago at the time, and using probability methods and some of the people who later worked, who were associated with our study, but it actually never saw the light of day. This was done in the early
Mm.
80s. And that probably wasn't political. It was more, there were some, I think, internecine problems on the research team. So I've gotten a little off track, but I just want to set up the background. So basically, what happens is that there's a lack of research, there is interest, there's obviously, and there's developing gay movement and gay worlds and public recognition of these things. So I'm going to switch a little bit. I'm going to switch to sort of my coming along because
Absolutely.
that
Yeah,
was
you've talked about this foundational study that you were such a huge contributor to, but I know myself as someone who's newer in the field and lots of other folks would like to know, how do you go from the graduating the year of Stonewall to doing this landmark study. What happened in between there? So maybe start with
Sure.
your college and graduate school experiences. What happened there?
Sure. Okay, so it's very interesting. And I think it is interesting, especially given this context and Pride Month and so on, and speaking as a gay man, that how, because that's part of the story. So, you know, um, I get to college a year or two later. I actually, anyway, in about 1970, I took a year off. I came to France, and that's where I'm speaking to you from today.
Lovely.
Partly, and that's maybe a little part of the story because I have done work here with my French colleagues after the Big Sex study, and therefore sort of have a life and a home here. But the thing is that there's, for me, this is a period, I mean, this is the late 60s, early 70s. It's a period of tremendous cultural and political and social change. And I'm caught up in it like everybody else. Very excited. Most of my interests in that period are in the anti-war movement, in the civil rights movement, and the counterculture in a certain way. Um, and at the same time, I'm hesitantly trying to figure out my own sexuality and my own what it means to be gay, which the word doesn't even really exist then. Gay was was a subcultural secret term which I had never heard when I was in college. And so I get to college and I'm interested in social life and social change and all that's going on. I want to make a contribution to involve myself. So I become a sociologist. I start studying sociology. At the same time, doing sociology at Wayne State University at that in the mid 73. um, I actually begin also to take statistics and methodology. I learned to do computerized data analysis, which was pretty much brand new at the time. And I was lucky that that we had the facilities and there were a few people to teach me. I had a great professor of methodology and statistics who worked for the United Auto Workers between times teaching at Wayne. And I remember, and I'm introduced to surveys. We did a GSS, General Social Survey, in our class where we drew our own sample,
That's
where we
great.
went out and interviewed in teams using questions from the General Social Survey. We're using SPSS to analyze our data. It turns out that version of SPSS had been produced, I later learned, by people at NORC. So anyway, that's going on. I am introduced to survey research, but I'm actually a little, I'm actually wary about
Hmm.
uh, quantitative empirical social science, although I love it. I love statistics. I love doing the computer data analysis, but I'm just not sure that it's going to have much impact and that you can address these pressing questions that are obsessing me about, uh, political change, civil rights. And interestingly, at Wayne in 1973, there was already 3 years after, 4 years after Stonewall, there was already a little gay liberation group on campus. And by luck or by whatever, by luck, actually, by almost by accident, I meet people who know people who are in this. And we were a tiny band. There were just a few of us. So I find gay liberation. So it's a very unusual, I think, coming out context. It was actually somewhat politicized. And so very quickly, I'm being exposed to the gay liberation movement across the country. We published a newspaper. I'm involved. We have coming out groups, and I'm doing little talks. So we were a few dozen, a few
So,
dozen.
Stuart, for those folks that may not know, tell us a little bit about the concept of gay liberation. What did that mean at the time? It's a phrase a lot of people have heard, but what did that
Sure,
stand for you?
sure. So that's a very good question. And so I think basically part of the story for me, and I think one of the things that was different, is that it was political and radical. And it was very much in the lineage of the women's movement.
Mhm.
I mean, these are sort of grassroots organizations. So when I say in the lineage of the women's movement, for example, one of the things we did was we called them rap groups. But they were based on consciousness raising, which had been a primary mechanism of the women's movement of the period to build itself. So it's people coming together, um, totally open in terms of who could be there. And of course, it's only a few people who are brave enough or lucky enough to find this thing. We had a little house off campus and that a few people lived in, and basically everything took place there. It's a very hippie alternative kind of world in a certain way. But anybody would come. That's how basically I show up on one of these groups that I've just sort of heard about. And the group of us that showed up at this rap group, and we basically just tell our own stories. But, at the same time, they're older people, like 2 or 3 years older. I'm like 21 or something. And they, of course, have been doing this for a bit longer. So you sort of learn the lingo. And for example, the part of what a big emphasis of the movement after Stonewall was to coming out, and this was a huge issue. So we kind of thought we knew that there were huge numbers of people who were having same-sex sex based on Kinsey's work 30, 40 years before, but there are very few visible people who are gay, lesbian, or whatever. So you're sort of in this in between. Um, and it's important to remember that in the 50s, the dominant conception of homosexuality at the time was, I think in the West, but especially in the US, dominated by psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis of the time. And so basically, and psychiatry and psychology in the US, that defined homosexuality as a mental illness. And even though I grew up in a liberal Jewish family that was very relatively cultured, sophisticated, perhaps, certainly politically and socially liberal, they were also very influenced by those ideas. So in my personal experience, in most of the environments I found myself in, it was actually taboo. It was not spoken. So, you've got these things, your feelings, your attractions, you're beginning to experiment, you're meeting people, but the authority figures in a certain way, the people you respect, your teachers, and you're looking for models and images. I think this is true for everybody growing up and every domain of their life. But it was particularly a difficult period. So gay liberation both was identifying with other movements at the time, the women's movement, the Black Power and Black Revolutionary movement, anti-imperialist struggles. We saw these things as being all interrelated. And so that's the liberation part.
Perfect.
Plus, this is a period of, I do believe, of quite radical social change in terms of sex. So between the women's movement and what we now call the LGBTQ plus movement, there's some real changes. But perhaps one of the biggest changes was this coming out, was this openness, this publicness. So the concept was that people were in the closet. So coming out of the closet into the streets was one of the slogans. Gay is good. So this term gay, I love this, that I remember that we were pushing this term. So gay had been used going back to the early parts of the 20th century in the subculture, but it was kind of an insider's term because that was part of the closet in those
Mm.
early years, was you could use language and use signs to figure out who was part of the family, um, and who was like you. And gay was a term, and gay has, anyway, but we start promoting it. So this is going to be, we're not going to, and homosexual had reeked, it still does, of this medicalized, and medicalized both in the sense of, it's sort of a diagnosis, but also a diagnosis of a disease, of a mental illness. So that's, and those kinds of things circulate more generally. They're not, you're not totally, I probably had some understanding and analysis, but I'm not sure it would be as clear as that. So that's what gay liberation was for me.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there are the beginnings of an academic reflection of that. I'd love to tell, when I taught gender and sexuality courses many years later, that I never took a course in it. But so there's no formal training.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bit of a lie. There was a cool professor, a young guy in my department who I became very close to, was one of my early mentors, who taught a sociology of sex roles course.
Okay.
Sex roles. So it was actually a feminism course, but sort of sexuality sort of filtered into it a little bit. And that's basically the only formal training I had on gender and sexuality, I think, through my PhD. All the rest was learned in the field, as it were.
So with this background that you've been talking about as a member of the gay liberation movement, and all of your sociology background, you described this tension with survey research, with the more quantitative side. How did that get resolved for you, or was it never a resolution? What did that process look like for you?
So in some ways, you probably hold these tensions. So basically, I figured out a way to make money, which was to work on research projects and do data analysis, which I really enjoyed. On the other hand, I'm studying, and I graduated from Wayne, and I went to University of Chicago, where I thought, everything would be wonderful and great. And I got there, and the department was quite conservative.
And this is for your
in
PhD,
many ways.
right?
I'm sorry?
This is for your PhD, right? The University of Chicago.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So I go there in 1977.
Okay.
The first weekend, by the way, I did run into somebody who knew somebody. So I went over to a little tea party. It was probably a drinks party of students at NORC, at NORC. So I knew about it, and the GSS was still like this amazing thing, but I was going to be cooler somehow. So and there wasn't actually coursework, as I remember it, in the department that was focused on that. And that's an interesting model. We had a sort of the University of Chicago PhD model in that period, and I think to a certain extent still today, was a bit of an apprenticeship model. You sort of took these heavy duty courses, but you then also worked on research projects. So I also didn't have an entree into a research project. And I wanted to do something more earth-shattering or something. So, and I was coming from Detroit, and I had been involved in a number of different political groups and movements, including gay liberation, where I was very out in my life in Detroit. I get to Chicago, but I still think for the problems at the time in the US that I understood and where I thought I could maybe make a contribution, and maybe the issues that were still troubling me the most, my focus was on race and class. And there was one great professor who had just published an important book, Bill Wilson, William Julius Wilson. His book had just come out, The Declining Significance of Race. I basically became a student of Bill's. However, Bill wasn't doing empirical research at the time. He was basically a sort of theorist and doing critical work, and more qualitative, broad So I kind of thought that's where I should go. And the other thing, which is, I don't know what this looks like for people today, but basically, and it was troubling for me, but it was also, I kind of made the decision. I went back in the closet professionally.
Mm.
I decided that I actually had this idea that I wasn't sure I wanted to be a professional gay man or make my gay identity my profession. And that's a struggle I think that a
Yeah.
lot of people have. It's, even in a much, much more open, accepting period, I mean, things are radically changed. When I think about it, the changes over the period of my youth to today seems really revolutionary. And it is one of the areas, I think, of social life that has changed the most rapidly. But it was still and then it was much harder. So I made this decision, which was a mistake. But there was nobody, I didn't see anybody around to model myself on. No professors, um, and no students. And so finally, I find a few students who are out. Nobody's doing gay work. I know about some of the early gay sociologists. I meet some of them. They're incredibly brave. I'm not sure I felt like I could do that. And I don't know what kinds of support systems these are older
Yeah.
guys, and a few women. And so I kind of ruled that out. So I'm going along doing uh, sort of studying race and class and looking at projects, but then I end up working as on research projects that are more qualitative, but that involve data analysis. That were actually kind of interesting, but they didn't. I didn't think this was what I wanted to do. They were at Northwestern University. They were on policing. That felt a little interesting, complicated politically, although they were progressive projects in many ways, not consciously, but they were certainly were not politically problematic. Um, but so anyway, I'm doing that. I have a life, and I'm slowly rebuilding a gay life in Chicago. One of the things was to move from Hyde Park, where the university is, that's a bit isolated, to the north side, where the more public, commercial, and residential gay community was. And and of course, this is happening. That's the other background that's important here. And it's a background that's very important for our study, is 1981 are when the first AIDS cases are identified in the US. And of course, that's on the coast, but very quickly, AIDS explodes, and it's in that period not well understood and highly stigmatized and associated with gay men. And so we're scared because gay men are dying of what we aren't even sure, but pretty quickly understand to be a sexually transmitted disease. The virus isn't identified until about 85, and there's a lot of controversy about what is actually causing men to get sick and die, mostly men. We also know, so I'm very quite aware of that. It's also beginning to have more and more impact on the gay community. And I'm loving living in Boys Town in Chicago. And so I'm struggling with figuring out what I'm going to do with my career. Should I? And so what happens is an accident. Through a friend, I hear about a guy who I've met, who's a public health doctor at Cook County Hospital. His name was Ron Sable, Dr. Ron Sable, and he's going to run for alderman in this area, and this in Boys Town, which is the gay concentration. And this is a few years after Harvey Milk in San Francisco. So I go, I run into Ron, and basically I start getting involved in his campaign about a year out. This happens a year or two before. I helped organize the gay pride contingent for a little crazy group that was promoting his candidacy, which nobody takes very seriously, but we had balloons, and it was kind of cool. And then he actually decides independently of me, that he's actually going to make a serious run. And so I got involved. So I started out as a volunteer, and it's a hugely exciting thing. And then I actually quit my job doing on the policing project and doing data analysis to work the last 3 months of the campaign. I think this is in 1986. He's running for alderman, city council in Chicago. And it's a very wonderful campaign. It motivates lots of people. I was the volunteer coordinator, and I was using a little bit of my survey background at times, well and not well. But anyway, just seeing how exciting this was for people, mobilizing people who basically were not political and had never thought that they could support or see a representative who represented them and looked like them. We came within a couple percentage points. So it was a very close race. He was running against a traditional Chicago machine candidate who basically reached out to the gay businessmen in the area and kind of split them. And he came, but we got this close. So that was, and if Ron had won, that would have changed my life, because I probably would have gone into politics and worked for him, and that might have, was excited about it, but it didn't happen. I was also afraid. I wasn't sure that was exactly my life. So actually, I've lost my job. And the AIDS epidemic is hitting bigger and bigger. And I started working with the City Department of Health, had money from CDC to support LGBT, basically, organizations, which were very primitive and different in that period, in their outreach and prevention. But it's hard to imagine what this looked like. I mean, Howard Brown, which is huge in Chicago now, was a storefront, and it grew because of this work. Anyway, I'm using evaluation survey skills that I had developed to help these organizations develop. And I'm being paid. And we actually did a survey through one of the survey research organizations and a friend of mine that I probably did the analysis for the city, but this is small scale stuff. And there's some exciting epidemiological work. But so I'm doing this, kind of getting by, living a life. It's not bad. I mean, interestingly, one of the things I realized and we realized is that Chicago was relatively spared. While we were the third or fourth largest city, the HIV/AIDS rates were much lower. So I'm not sure I would have survived had I been and many of my friends were dying, especially in New York and San Francisco, and then somewhat later on a time delay in Chicago, including Ron Sable and some of the people I had worked most closely on the campaign. That comes in the next few years, 4 or 5 years after that. But anyway, so I'm doing that. And then I hear that one of my professors at the University of Chicago is talking about and applying for designing a national sexual behavior study. I'm not sure exactly how I understood it at the time, but something like that. So I hear about this a little bit late. I basically make an appointment and I go see Ed Lahman, who I had studied with in organizations, and he's a social network specialist. But so he knew me, I knew him, but we had not worked closely together. And I sort of decided this is my chance in a way to get involved in something closer to these issues that are central to my life in my sociology work. So there's two problems. I have to come out to Ed. I'm not out in the department. I mean, some of the students know, but none of the professors, I don't think, knew. There was no one really I would have thought to talk to. So I immediately go in, and so I tell Ed about the work I've been doing, or I had been doing. I think this maybe, I'm not sure. I may have whether the Sable campaign. No, this is after the Sable campaign. I'm sure. But I've talked about the Work in the Stable campaign, and I've actually been beginning to think about maybe this is what I should do my dissertation on. These incredibly massive changes politically and socially that are going on in the gay community. So I at least float that idea with him, but I come out to him. He doesn't seem at all, bothered by that. In fact, it's kind of maybe useful and interesting. And he'd always liked me. I did well in his courses. I had respect for his stuff. I wasn't quite going in that direction. So he says, let me think about it. And I leave. And I get an email from his assistant, who was a friend of mine in the department. And she's been working on the proposal for a year. I had no idea this had been going on. I would have loved to have been involved in a long process with people all over the university and the medical school, probably around the country, while they're writing the proposal. It's final days. We all know what proposals look like at the end. They're rushing to put, and they were big in those days too. So Tina calls me, Martina Morris, and she says, I need, Ed would love you to be on this project, if we get it. I need 2 paragraphs from you. I need a paragraph about the work you've been doing in the gay community and your methodology and analysis qualities, survey data analysis or computerized data analysis, whatever it was, I'm not sure. So I write these 2 paragraphs. I send them to Tina. They go in the proposal. And 6 months later, at the end of 1987, I get a call that we won. And on January 1988, you need to show up and we're going to start. And so it's the beginning of 1988. We have a 2 or 3 year grant to design a big study, a big national sexual behavior study of adults. Tina and I get corner offices at NORC, because NORC actually had submitted the proposal, but Lauman at the University of Chicago is the PI, and a few other, there are 2 other PIs who are quite important. One is John Gagnon, who actually was one of the few sociologists of that period who was working on sexuality. He had been a product of the University of Chicago, and he went to the Kinsey Institute in the late 50s, and he's a professor at Stony Brook. Wow. And Ed had chosen him as one of his collaborators. And then there was Bob Michael, who's an economic demographer, who was the director of NORC. So that's the senior team. And then Tina and I are the representatives of the researchers, and we're working with the NORC staff, and we're within the new digs that NORC had at that moment. It was very exciting. We immediately began. However, it's an interesting, important thing that this is also, it's politically fraught. So it had taken a long time. During the Reagan administration, there was huge resistance. Reagan refused to say the word AIDS for about 5 or 6 or 7 years. It was scandalous and upsetting for us, and both the public health world and obviously the communities affected. But in 1985, when Rock Hudson dies, things start to change. There's a new public sort of recognition and human response. And of course, there's been people pushing for the need for information and data of all sorts, epidemiological, medical, but also social. And people who've been wanting to do big surveys and big research projects who finally have some backing and funding. On the other hand, there's also lots of criticism and critique from much more conservative elements in Congress and within the establishment in the institutions in the administration. So we're caught right in between. So on the one hand, they were pushing us to rush to collect data. And on the other hand, they're talking about this should never be done. And I have to say, it's both a kind of badge of honor, but it was also a little scary at the time.
Yeah.
I was attacked personally, as was John Gagnon, because we represented, so there was a letter that went around to members of Congress just decrying this study. And they specifically said that Gagnon, who had been at the Kinsey Institute, and they misattributed some stuff to him, but he had worked on a thing on sexual offenders, which was true, and they took something out of it. And then there's this guy, Stuart Michaels, who's like, and their goal is to show that 20% of the US population is gay, is homosexual, which, yeah, in our dreams. But that wasn't obviously what we were trying to do, but we were curious too. We thought, wow, we're going to finally be able to produce some data and know. Anyway, so this, and that immediately, it's going on right from the beginning. So the study is both, on the other hand, agencies like CDC and NCHS and the Army come to us and they want the data tomorrow.
Huh.
We're just there to, we're actually supposed to design a study. They want the data tomorrow. So there was a compromise. It's a little interesting and smart on the part of Ed and Bob, I think. They understand we've got to be careful because we could get some quick extra money and we could try to do a study, a national sample, say. But if we do that, it's going to be minimal.
Yeah.
And that we may not get a chance to do the big study. Plus, we're supposed to design really a rigorous, complete study. So I think Bob came up with this idea. The compromise was we included questions on the GSS in 1988 in a small self-administered supplement that included very basic questions on sexual behavior. And those data actually are still there and are still being collected. They've grown a little bit, and they're an incredibly rich data source because it is a time series that didn't exist anywhere else. And of course, it's the GSS sample and the quality of the GSS in terms of response rates and blah, 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 blah. So we did do that. Meanwhile, we're trying to design this study. I do have to say, one thing that was interesting, and I'll never forget it, is that we're, the top sampling people at NORC are involved, lots of debates and discussions. We don't know that much, but we know a lot. Plus, we have a scientific review panel that brought in people from, I remember there were epidemiologists from CDC, but there's a lot top survey researchers and demographers, and there's lots of debates, including among the experts, about whether this is possible.
Huh.
And it's very interesting, the voices that said you can do this. One was the epidemiologist. He's the guy, I'm blocking on his name at the moment, but he's the guy who did the patient zero study, actually. He was a field demographer at CDC, and he knew a lot about collecting STI and sex information, contact tracing, all that stuff. He said, of course you can ask people these questions. But a lot of the senior researchers were, in other places, were a little bit wary. Most of the research that had been done by survey people had been attitude surveys. That was a big thing in the 60s and 70s, but almost no behavioral research. The other thing that I forget exactly at what moment, but the big revelation. So I have the same question. The possibility of randomly selected representative sample of adults, and you go in and you say, how many people did you have sex with and what were their sexes and blah, 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 or some, your imagination is that you're going to ask them these frank questions right up. Of course, you're not going to do that. We didn't do that. But the fear, will they answer the questions, or will they slam the door in your face? Will they be honest? All of these questions are real and still present and were important and created doubts, certainly in me. And it was, what I remember is at the same time, we are actually needing to write the questionnaire. And I remember talking, and I had, access. NORC was much smaller at that period. And so you could kind of get to every, the head stats sample design person, the HOUD survey sort of psychologist, and all the senior field staff. So it was the field interviewers who looked me in the eye, who knew a lot more than me. I'm a young Turk, and said, Of course, Stuart. We ask these questions all the time. I mean, we're doing drug studies, we're doing crime studies. We go to people, and the minute this woman, and there were older women, that staff, the minute she said that to me, I understood. I said, of course. I mean, all the problems of, reliability, validity, and truth, that's a secondary question. But we can collect basic data. It's not going to be impossible. We can get in the door and we can collect data. So anyway, that was a big deal.
I love that point, Stuart, and it's something that we need to remember today, I think. Listen to your interviewers. They're often a lot smarter than you about these boots on the ground issues. So I love that point. So salient now, very salient then. Great insight.
Anyway, this is going on, I know, but basically, I do want to tell the story because I think it's also useful. What does happen is, as we're getting closer and closer, there is more and more opposition within the administration and within Congress. And so this is the period, some people will remember him because he's really notorious and infamous, Jesse Helms, who was, and he was the person who was attacking the arts and, blah, blah, blah. So, and anything, I don't know, pornographic for him. So anyway, he was one of our major opposition. There were people, and of course, we're being told by NIH and ICHD that we've got to be quiet and not rock the boat and, slow, and they're sending out information packets. I mean, there's a kind of lobbying that's going on. I know that they spoke to other people, Moynihan, among others, some of the more liberal and knowledgeable Congress people about the need for the survey. But anyway, long story short, Helms led a charge to actually add an addition to the budget amendment saying that you couldn't ask American adults these questions. So that passed. And in that speech to defend that, he did again attack me personally. My friend said, you should sue him. And he said, well, but how can I sue him? He said, I'm running the project and I'm this great leader of the gay community. I mean, he's only inflated my importance 40,000 times. And, there is a tiny grain of truth. So anyway, but it's also a badge of honor. And, but anyway, the bad news was, of course, they stopped the project. The good news was that the social need was so strong that private foundations stepped up. And basically, I think Bob is the head of NORC and an eminent economic demographer. Lauman is a big sociologist. They were able to go to their contacts at the major foundations. So Robert Wood Johnson, MacArthur, Ford, Rockefeller, and 2 or 3 others immediately pony up money. Problem, of course, is that they don't have the bucks that would have been used to do the real study. So one point that's important to remember is that the design we were coming up with was meant to be as efficient and small as possible, called for 14,000 interviews, okay? With the private funding that we got, because basically up to that point, we're still hoping to get federal money. But basically at that point, when the laws passed, it didn't mean it would never, ever happen, but it meant it was going to be delayed. Private foundations, we go that route. So the work was eventually all privately funded. Although we continued to do some methodological work and we turned in a report, the sample size of the National Health and Social Life Survey of 1992 is about 3,400.
Okay.
So 14,000, 3,400. So that's kind of the story of the study, and it's a huge thing. I think the other thing that's interesting here is obviously the gay stuff. to put it mildly, because of me. There's, obviously the book that we did, Social Organization of Sexuality, is out there as a reference. There was a popular book written at the same time, Sex in America. I Anyway, and there's lots of information, but and of course the data's out there and so on and so forth. But the thing that I've been thinking about, and I think is sort of interest to AAPOR and these kinds of interviews, is particularly the work that we did on LGBT, which at the time, so the chapter that I wrote for the Social Organization of Sexuality is called Homosexuality. And it's a straightforward report of all the data. But we're also writing the questionnaire. We're also developing this data. So the things start, and that's from very early on. This is one of the things, and as it turns out, without really, there was just, obviously we have access to really amazing people. We're having lots of discussions with experts. We're thinking about this, and we're working with our colleagues, junior and senior at NORC, who have lots of experience running surveys. But one of them, the thing, and the survey, which people need to remember, is this survey is of the general population. There was research going on at the time, before, during, and after, that is focused on the community.
Yes.
Right? There are lots of SGM research projects. I've worked on a number since. So community-based purposive sampling of that sort is very important for digging down where you sort of can presume or you're studying within a specific group. Mm-hmm. But this was really about replicating things on the scale of the whole population. And so there's a tremendous balance. And the questions that were outstanding were both, we've got to estimate prevalences of certain things in the population and rates, but we also we need to understand these things in that kind of context. And that's really where most of my work has been focused. We've got to write all these questions. And I think this project, actually, I have tremendous respect for what we did. I ended up going to France after, that's why I have a life here, to work with a team who did the French national study. So in 1992, there were actually national studies in France and in England that are very comparable, that were completely independent of each other. So it does prove how the social need of that moment was calling for and produced.
Absolutely.
But they're different. Each one had a different type of team, and our team was more sociologists and demographers. The French was more public health epidemiologists, and the English team, I think, was more sexual health people. It was 4 women, it's 4 men in the US, and it's a large group in France. I will say, I'm pretty sure this is true, that on the 2 other teams, there were openly gay folks around those teams, but the main gay sociologist in France was dying of AIDS at the time, Michael Pollack, and he had helped get the study started, but he's not a member of the team. And there was nobody else on the team that I ever learned, and I worked with them, who was gay. And I think it turns out that it made a difference anyway, our idea was and this was part of the larger project in the US, was we were very concerned to make this, not reduce this to a behavior accounting scheme. So to not let this be completely reductionist. If we want to understand the data we're going to collect, which is going to be focused on sexual practices and behavior, we need to put it in context. And the context was relationships. So we really did a life course history. We did a last year history of sexual partners. And there were a lot of other questions, including, interestingly, and obviously the behavior questions, a lot of work to figure out how to ask these questions and how best to ask them, especially
Absolutely.
Not having a lot of experience and not having all the time in the world to test. But I think we did a pretty good job. As it turns out, it looks like it worked. Of course, we had self-administered parts and so on and so forth. But what turns out, I would say, to be the thing that probably I ended up doing that's probably had the most effect in the world is we included a sexual identity question. Super simple. Do you think of yourself as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or something else? I do remember, and it seemed obvious to me and my colleagues, especially my gay colleague, um, that it would be hard to understand a lot of the information we're going to get about behavior if we don't know how people think of themselves. And we're going to want to use this information in various ways. So maybe that's a good idea. It just seemed obvious. So none of the other major surveys in that period, the gay community surveys didn't ask the question because they presumed everyone was gay.
Hmm.
Some of them did, some of them didn't. They may have asked about self-denomination, but not, often it wasn't even asked. Um, and the English and French surveys at the same time don't ask the question. So interestingly, it turns out this question, a version of this question, an updated version of this question, is the standard question on every survey at all related to this area, much to my chagrin at times. I'm very unhappy that, and I can call them out, I've sort of told them, but it's, anyway, that let's say major health surveys that have even a real health focus for the general population will ask the sexual identity question. Actually, they help develop it into its finest form, which I really respect. But they don't ask any behavior questions. And, I come out of the HIV/AIDS period. I mean, come on, sexually transmitted diseases and some of the other unanticipated outcomes of sex actually depend on behavior and specifics about behavior. And we can ask these questions, guys. But I should say on the other side, there are plenty of surveys that include a sexual identity question, but they think it's the whole answer. And that's, I guess, the other point I would make about my approach when what I did with our data. So we were thinking about this, and it's within this larger context. And I think we were thinking about it, but when we finally get the data, it especially becomes clear that the phenomena we're trying to understand are not as simplistic and categorical as people think. And I think that as a member of a minority. I mean, it's very easy for me to say I'm a gay man, but I also know the complexity of what that means. And I know the confusions of people. So there are men who have sex with men who may or may not really be gay, depending on how you define gay. And of course, that becomes a big issue in the HIV epidemic, and it also is a cultural and subcultural issue. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all of that, but it's very important. But I kind of understood that already back then, partly maybe because of some of those early discussions, that we needed to think about this as analytically clearly as possible. So basically, we'd include lots of different questions, including a sexual attraction question. Again, very simple. And it was the standard. They called it the Kinsey question, not Kinsey's question. It's sort of based on the idea of a Kinsey scale. So of attracted to men or women or both and in between and on a 5-point or something. Okay, we're going to have that. Obviously, even though it's a disease-driven, AIDS-driven survey, we should probably ask that question. And we're going to ask a ton of behavior questions. So, every moment of your life and cumulative and last year and everything. So my approach and my analysis for that chapter was based on a very simple idea, which was we were dealing with something that needs to be thought of in its complexity and that is multidimensional. And the way I talked about that is we need to think about behavior, we need to think about desire and identity. And in a general population context, one of the things that jumps out at you is that these are not perfectly overlapping. And I made a Venn diagram and blah, blah, blah. And that's what I remember talking about with people. And this is what I would present at conferences and talk about a lot, because it was kind of a wake up. It was hard for a lot of people to get their heads around. I mean, it seems totally obvious to me, but And that we should probably think about attraction even when there's no behavior and no identity. And we should think about possibilities of people have identities, but they don't actually have experience,
Mhm.
and maybe not attraction. I mean, all these things are possible. And there's, of course, going to be modal major groups that look one way or another. Um, I guess the one other thing I would say about that moment and that history, which is kind of important, is there was a little bit of bad news in the project, which is that the numbers were very, very low compared to people's expectations. So, and this is a bit of a complicated story, which I've written about with colleagues, but basically the Kinsey data had very high. This is Kinsey's. My feeling is Kinsey's. Well, first of all, Kinsey's data was very high. So 37% of men in the male sample in Kinsey report had had a sexual experience with another male at least once in their life. And then the 10% number had been generated out of his statistics. Kinsey, by the way, was opposed to the idea of gay and straight. He didn't want to divide the world into homosexuals and heterosexuals. He said, not sheeps and goats. There's really continua all over the place here, which is an important point he was making, but he also was kind of pushing against categorization identity. But the 10% number was that it was taken by the gay men of the era out of his statistical tables, and it was the sort of compromise number. It was the number of men who had more, I think it's more homosexual than heterosexual experience for 3 years or more during their adult life. But 10% was such a wonderful, easy number, as we pointed out. It also, and there's reasons to believe that's part of the motivation, consciously or unconsciously. It corresponded approximately to the Black population in the U.S. So what's the most significant minority group in the U.S. at that period, in the early 50s? These are gay leaders, the founders of Mattachine and so on, before gay liberation comes along. And then the early gay organizations. We need to establish our importance socially and politically and our presence. So we're going to make a claim about, even though we're invisible. I mean, clearly nobody can see 10% of the population as queer at that time. They're just, they might be there, but they're also that it was, this is the 50s. And it's an interesting thing. So, however, our numbers, where we're asking all these different questions, come up much lower. And I knew that before we actually collected our data because of the GSS data. And at first I didn't believe it. I thought everyone's lying. Nobody's admitting. And I would say it's obvious that any numbers of any socially stigmatized status or behavior are going to be underreported. So there's no question that there's plenty of non-normative stuff that is underreported in any survey. But I also realize that we're living in a period when there are plenty of people who are busy asserting their status as a member of a group, living more or less public lives and politically motivated, and in the context of a valid, appropriate, behind closed doors interview for a public health purpose, those people are going to tell you. So, those, I think, our numbers mean something both in terms of reality and also politically and socially. But they were very low. And I was attacked. I wasn't personally attacked, luckily, nicely. But there was a great upset immediately. And the study as a whole was actually, interestingly, perceived in its moment as conservative. Kinsey was radical and revolutionary because of its effects, and maybe a little bit because of we understand a little bit more Kinsey's motivations. But our survey wasn't meant to be conservative, but it's viewed that way, and it was reassuring to people and blah, blah, blah. And there were issues that, interestingly, were quite unresolved, and that people, a lot of the response was there was tremendous misunderstanding about how HIV/AIDS was uh, progressing, and there was this great fear of heterosexuals, whatever that means, a heterosexual epidemic, which hadn't come to be and never came to be. But so these numbers were reassuring to people for that. Plus, anyway, and they were comparing to Kinsey, which that's a very interesting question. I'm not going to go there, all the reasons why there might be those differences. So, okay, that's kind of the big story. I don't know. I'm sure I've left out lots of parts, but are
That
there any
is
pieces?
so fantastic to hear about it. We understand the methodological contributions that this study had. We understand the substantive contributions that this study had. But to hear about how all of these external factors, political motivations, and all of the behind the scenes negotiating that has to happen to make a study like this actually come about, that it's just very, very enlightening. And it's a reminder that no study happens in a vacuum, and incredibly important studies most
Right.
definitely don't happen in a vacuum. So now that we've talked about the Big Sex study and its methodological importance, what are some other methodological contributions that you've made that you're particularly proud of outside of the Big Sex study?
Yeah, well, I would say nothing on that level. I do think, I mean, that was really an important moment. It was a big study. We had a lot of time and support. There's a big publication, et cetera. So I don't think anything I've ever done necessarily holds a candle. On the other hand, and some, for good or for bad, some of the ideas, like it's interesting, all the work written on questionnaire design around these topics, and which I advise on, I work with, and
Mhm.
sometimes I notice that the great National Academy report and stuff, they all start with the multidimensional and my distinctions. I don't think some of the more careful ones were actually vaguely, I'm not personally, but were acknowledged, but sometimes not. So, it's an important insight. It's now kind of out there. I guess, I would say, Jerry, that most of the things are in some senses continuations, right? So the one of the biggest changes, obviously, in the world, and for me in that period since, after the survey, I went to France for 4 years, worked with that team. Then I went back to the University of Chicago and I taught for 9 years, or helped run their Center for Gender Studies, it was called at the time. But even from its start, it was a Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies. So I was teaching for 10 years, and I got to really learn about the theory and the academic work being done in these fields like feminism and women's studies and LGBTQ studies. Um, but let me see what exactly was my point here. Um, uh, did have So let's see. Oh, well, I guess one thing I was sort of one of the points was that it seems to me that the problems that we discovered continue. We're working, it feels like we're working out and forward. Okay. So, the problems of measurement, the problems of sampling. I mean, one of the things of the projects I was involved in, I'm not sure it's the solution, but, and I'm sure our AAPOR viewers are very aware of the problems of both of sampling and um, interviewing in the world today. I mean, back in the day, this is, first of all, a face-to-face household-based survey. We have a 75% response rate, which we were really frustrated by because, in that period, you could get close to 80%. And, when you have that kind of resources and money and you can do household-based, you can get a little bit close. But obviously, nobody does for most surveys.
Right.
So big government project census, others, you're on that sort of order. But so a lot of the work I've ended up working on was not. And then I did a lot of HIV related work. So, for just an example was, and I now remember what my plan was. An example is responder driven sampling. So, I mean, and the other thing I would say, and I am concerned that people be very careful and worry about representativeness and probability based versus non. But I also understand that I'm a survey researcher. Like everybody else, this project and every project where we can't do everything, it's got to be fit for purpose. There are ways that you make compromises with the resources you have, your best knowledge and your best technology. And I think that's so important to still do it. The perfect cannot get in way of the contribution and the. So that's the kind of things that I've been working on. The other thing that I will say I'm curious about and interested in, and one of the things that's come up in my work is, and I'm sure some younger viewers may be actually really offended by everything we've said up till now, because this world was a world before transgender in many, many ways. So I would say one of the most interesting and important things in terms of the changes in the world, and therefore the changes in subjects of research and techniques for research, is the relationship. The way I think of it is the relationship between gender and sexuality. That's one of the reasons I talked about teaching, because I read a lot of literature that I hadn't really been, except that one course back in 1973. And the world was changing. That's another point that I would make, and I hope I've communicated it, is that, social science research is a really interesting endeavor, because we're not dealing with something that's outside of us that doesn't change. And we're also a part of the social world. So there's this incredibly dynamic process. So I tried to communicate, our understandings at the time were of the time, and there were social needs that we were addressing. So those create both advantages and wonderful aspects of the study, but also limitations. And interestingly, so, and I ended up, worrying about what is this phenomenon that I'm most interested in, because it's sort of related to me, of what does it mean to be a sexual minority, a gay man or whatever, a bisexual, etc. And then suddenly, I start teaching, and, I have students, my first quarter, I have this student who writes her final, well, I think of her as she, writes her final paper as about her transition. And she's one of the first people. I mean, I knew a certain version. There's an old-fashioned versions of trans that was back in the gay community and back in the early days, but it was very different. So the modern transgender phenomenon and person was just happening. So what's wonderful about this is it kind of upsets the apple cart. If you think about it, our conception of sexual orientation is defined in terms of a binary of gender. So when I ask my question, do you think of yourself, and now I would, the question would be, do you think of yourself as gay or lesbian, straight, that is not gay or lesbian, bisexual or something else? That's still, all of those categories for that question assume that there's basically just a simple binary. And of course, we know people who are in this world, who are in touch with it or looking, have our eyes open, or who are younger, are well aware that it's becoming much more complicated, that doesn't really cover the basis for a whole section of the population. So we need to ask I don't think it's about getting rid of that question. I think these things coexist and change. So it's really more about being open, attentive, and responsive to what's important and what's changing. And of course, I kind of love it. I mean, it upsets the apple cart. So it presents new challenges. And I've done studies where of Actually, they were mainly, I'm thinking of a study of young Black men who have sex with men on the south side of Chicago that was an AIDS-driven uh, HIV prevention study, and which we did pretty intense, and a lot of social network stuff. But just the variation in that population and being able to capture that for useful purpose, for how do we save people's lives, and save other people's lives. So it's a challenge,
I
and
really
I think
think
it's
that
a
that's such
challenge
a
we're
good
up
point.
for. We're up
Yeah.
to and up for. Um,
I mean, as the person who really thought about sexuality as a multidimensional construct, you just said, I would love to be wrong and therefore to be more dimensions. It upsets the apple cart. I think
right.
that's a great attitude to have as a researcher that, and maybe this goes back to your tension between the quantitative survey world and there may not be a particular truth that is always existing in the world.
No, no,
You know,
no. That's one
our
of
our
the things
understanding
that's
evolves.
right. It's one of the things that's so wonderful about this work. I mean, frustrating all the time. I think we probably everybody knows that, but also incredibly exciting and satisfying. That you're always, pushing the envelope and challenged. And the other thing I thought about as I was thinking about this, and I hope it comes through in the story, is I think the other reason why I kind of loved that I found myself in this world is that it's collective, it's teamwork. And that's I wanted to make a point of this story about, kind of working with the field staff who I think, some of the academic colleagues probably think they're the help, but they they have a lot of knowledge. And, obviously being open and attentive to the people we're trying to study and what their perspectives and understandings are. But there's something about these challenges of survey research that I find continuously frustrating, but also continuously satisfying. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. And so you just said a really good piece that this type of research is collaborative. So what
that's right.
other pieces of advice would you have for, someone who's starting in sexuality and health research, or even folks who are currently in the field?
Well, I
It's
don't.
a big question.
Good luck. Good luck. Good luck. What I would hope for, especially in the current moment. I mean, it's I've watched things go up and down where, how much it was an uphill battle for us. I mean, how lucky we were in lots of ways. I mean, there were definitely people who wanted to do this research and who were willing to support it and so on. And then there was a period when this became a big deal, and suddenly, one of, both understanding around public health and HIV/AIDS, but also about social, ending social stigma and discrimination and inequality around gender and sexual minority statuses. That's still going on, but obviously it's tremendously under attack. So I think, what I just hope that it's encouraging. I mean, by trying to be realistic and to understand. I mean, the other thing, which of course it is weird when you're a sex researcher, it's hard to remember the original moments. I mean, but it happens really fast. You start working on these questionnaires and you get used to language. I mean, I don't know if it's the same today because pop culture
It
has
is.
changed so much, but I can remember. And listen, I was living in worlds already. Most of the people around me were, queer or whatever, highly, they're pretty out there. But still, I realized that I would go home and, I'd be shockingly easy to talk about penises, vaginas, and anal and vaginal sex and things like that. So I don't, I'm not sure. It's just that I, it's, I think it's important for people. First of all, I think also to accept their reticences and be in touch with them, that this is a little scary. I don't know if we can do this, but also be wanting to push, because that's where I feel like, this research was limited in many, many ways, and all research is limited. And so I think being really open-minded, also following your passion, Part of my takeaway hope moral is that, I see my life as a life where, I was reticent because of social attitudes and my fears, and your fears are usually worse than the reality. Actually, when you think about it, I've been incredibly lucky and, no, very little negative. I mean, the worst thing, I'm attacked for being this big gay leader. And well, it hurt the study. I mean, I didn't feel good about that. But I think especially I lost some time in my life by being worried about whether I could pursue something that was of interest, and whether it would be accepted and important. Uh, the world changed, though, as much as anything.
That's great. So, you've talked so much about your career, how you started, how you got there, and APOR is the one who brought you and I together to talk about
Right.
this today. How has APOR as an organization figured into your journey? Where did you have areas of overlap? Did you encounter colleagues that you wouldn't have met otherwise? Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I think I mentioned this to you when we first met, is that one of the oddities, I discovered APOR because of the study. When I was I was relatively junior, I was a graduate student. But APOR was one of the first places where we started presenting the work we were doing. So I went to APOR, and it turns out you can do this. I don't know if people know that, because I was invited to give a talk, and I didn't have to be a member. I wasn't a member yet.
Hmm.
I wasn't that far along in my profession that I really, and I'm a sociologist, so I've been at ASA. I'm sort of doing sex research, so I was also invited to the International Academy of Sex Research because people are very interested in this work. This is before the work is published. So that was my first introduction to APOR. And I will tell you that I loved it because of its multidisciplinarity, but not beyond academic. I love that APOR, and so I become a member, and I was probably not that active, but I was active for a very long time, went to as many APOR meetings as I could, because I love that it was people using similar research for different purposes. And I find that very, very helpful. I mean, my interpretation is you have all the methodology people, you have all the kind of substantive people, the government people, but I love that there were the journalists and the campaign people, so the political pollsters. And I find that incredibly rich. That I think because we're sort of dealing in different worlds and different problems. um, the other thing, of course, that's been very, refreshing is, first of all, the work was immediately of interest to people. I never, I so we and you learn a lot. You learn a lot from people who have related experiences. So that's been my experience of it.
Thanks for sharing that. So, one final question for you, just to kind of wrap things up. What question do you wish I would have asked? And answer that question for me. So, what's one
Do you
thing that
mean
you wish I'd
you
asked you?
or the
Yeah,
survey back then?
what's one question that you wish I would have asked you so that you could have answered it?
Well, I think most people who see this will realize that you didn't get a lot of room to ask
It's so
questions.
captivating,
And,
Stuart. It
just
really
to be
is.
perfectly honest, this was a very wonderful opportunity for me because it lets me sort of dig into my own past and reflect on it, which I think mostly it gets better and better with age. I mean, I'm 74 years old now. So I've got a lot of history to look back on. And so I've enjoyed this, and I did a lot of thinking. So I don't feel like we didn't cover anything that I really was hoping to cover. I'm sure afterwards I'll think of things, but this has
Of
been a
course.
lovely conversation. And you've been a great interlocutor in that sense, Jerry.
Thank
So
you.
I appreciate it.
Well, Stuart, on behalf of myself and AAPOR, I want to say thank you for doing this interview with me. But not just that, thank you for your contributions to the field, for your bravery in getting this research and your identity out there, and for withstanding literally personal attacks from members of Congress, even if they were a badge of honor. So thank you so much. I am very grateful and very honored to have been able to talk to you today. Thank you.
Me too. And I look forward to seeing your and our other colleagues work in this area, and they can bury me and my work by doing new stuff.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you.